Hello, my dear friends. How are you? Welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Marty Theriger, and today I would like to speak about the Witch's Spellbook. This is in response to a question posed by one of my patrons. I was talking with my patrons about the black art books in Swedish tradition, which I shall do a video about this subject to present at YouTube. Wait, as a matter of fact, by the time you watch this video at YouTube, I've probably already delivered a video on the black art books, right? Hopefully so. I'm working on it. A patron asked me about the tradition of spellbooks and grimoires, where it started and how long does this tradition goes, and if it's only a thing found in Sweden and Icelandic cultures and traditions, which are two cases I've spoken here more frequently. And since we are at the spooky season, and as is tradition in this channel every year, delivering content related to the mood of the season, I've decided to answer this question in video format for all to see, and I will schedule this for October. So let me go straight to it, right? If you please. So we have to take into consideration that nowadays we often make very specific distinctions between witches, sorcerers, magicians, healers, and so on and so forth, because since the New Age movement, particularly on spirituality, there has been quite a lot of movements, and each has the necessity to put on labels to distinguish themselves from one another. However, as recent as the 20th century, outside these New Age movements like Neo-Paganism, Neo-Druidry, Core Shamanism, Wicca, also through, and many others, in traditional folk magic of many cultures, people didn't usually use these distinctions and labels, as the same people who could perform spells could also curse and could also heal and sanctify, etc. Everything in one person. So these people would write about their own works of magic. They would compose their own spell books, their black art books, grimoires. You get the point, right? So these recorded spells and incantations and other magic methods and such throughout the centuries, the ones that have survived, of course, influenced eventually modern practices, which we shall get to that in a moment or further ahead. My cat. But it is art to truly... Sorry, Gigi, one of my cats, distracted me. She's always a distraction. Where was I? Yeah. So, as I was saying, it's hard to truly define a period when witchcraft originated and took root. Why you do this to me? Pragmatic behaviors towards the spiritual in order to influence and alter reality to provoke an effect that sees to manifest something towards a particular objective that isn't possible through mundane means. It is something that exists since before written record. However, the concept and practice of witchcraft dates back to classical antiquity. And I'm not just talking about Rome and the Hellenic cultural world, but ancient Egypt too. Even before, actually to another one, to ancient Mesopotamian, and throughout the early Chinese Empire, we also start to see this, etc. So people who chanted incantations, made potions, would cast spells, they have recorded their methods. So ancient Egyptians and Greeks laid down liturgy and literature on papyrus. For instance, referencing spells that required an offering of frankincense or the placing of an uncorrupted and pure child in a trance before a glowing fire. So these are just some early examples. And these indeed are perhaps the earliest written examples of witchcraft of classical antiquity. But actual books of magic and sorcery and in the occult arts that have survived, obviously, were far more common in the Middle Ages, when people start to compile extensive methods of the magical arts. So there's one particular book you may be familiar with, even if it's just a title, Picatrix, right? Written around the 10th, 11th centuries, which was actually an Arabic book of magic and astrology, whose original title I can't possibly pronounce. I don't know how to pronounce that, which later was translated into Spanish and then into Latin in the 13th century, gaining this new name of Picatrix in Latin. So originally written in Arabic, it's a work that confirms the precept that witchcraft transcends cultural boundaries. It became popular throughout Europe. It is a work with more than 400 pages, which includes some concoctions with very pretty disgusting ingredients, along with spells, of course, and focusing on astrological energy in the pursuit of knowledge and power. It's a very interesting reading. So in a way, it's actually quite similar to the Icelandic Galdrabok, right, of which I have spoken here before several times, written in the around the 16th century, and contains contributions from numerous witches, numerous sorcerers, as it is the very product of the consolidation of Western and Eastern magic, European, Arabic, Hebraic magic treatises compiled and fused during the Renaissance, which eventually gave rise to other grimoires and influenced many cultures into creating grimoires based on this culmination of magic traditions. Sorry. And the Galdrabok is the material proof of that. So this also goes to show that in countries and nations that were Christian, particularly Catholic, magic books, spell books, were particularly important and widespread and were written and compiled by Christians. And this also goes to show that despite the religious conflicts of the Middle Ages between the Christian world and the Muslim world, and despite the widespread of anti-Semitism, Christians were compiling and translating Arabic and Hebrew works of magic and adding the content to their own magic traditions. And a good example is the book of Honorius, whose origins are debatable, but its oldest preserved manuscript dates back to 1347, the 14th century, and has as its opening a stinging rebuke of the Roman Catholic Church. And it's a text that assists in the practice of necromancy, or communication with the dead, as it was more common until later on, eventually it became synonym with invoking demons and whatnot, which isn't the original case. It was mostly to communicate with the dead, right? By the way, one of the taboos concerning the book of Honorius is that those who ascribe to its teachings are required to refrain from keeping company with women. Is this why Christian priests can't marry women and can't have sexual intercourse with women? Was it necromancy all along? Anyway, the point here is that tangible evidence points to a substantial body of written witchcraft teachings that span the period from ancient times through the early modern period, even now more or less our contemporary time. So these are of great historical significance, as well as important to those who want to have a hand on these methods for whichever reasons. But of course, this tradition never truly stopped in a way. Written evidences of witchcraft, spells, incantations, and other methods, magical methods, continued to be recorded by those who perform these acts and those who continue to express and experience them and experiment on this, and also try new things and record their actions and methods, usually for themselves only, at least until the 19th century. We have many examples in Portugal, Spain, France, Sweden, a few in Norway, in Iceland as well, of course. I've spoken here many times before about these, which eventually these private spell books were either given to museums and national libraries by collectors or were found in people's homes, which is why we know of the existence of many spell books of the modern period, particularly those written in the past 500 years. I have given or will give after I record this video, but submit it before this video, hopefully, the example of the Swedish black art books, right? So, the body of written texts associated with witchcraft varies widely and includes books of magic spells called grimoires. I have spoken here of grimoires before in other videos and in this video, and I would like to inform you on that as well, since it calls for it, right? So the grimoire is a general handbook for witches. Grimoires include spells, incantations, instructions for making talismans and amulets, and procedures for summoning angels, demons, let's say otherworldly entities and spirits. So the earliest grimoires are believed to have been produced in ancient Mesopotamia, actually, and predate the 4th century before the Common Era. And, well, it is. The grimoires this is an essential component of a witch's work. The books themselves have at times been considered sources of supernatural power and strength. We see this precisely in the tradition of black art books themselves in Swedish traditional witchcraft, in which the books themselves are often considered the source of magical power, and as long as the black art book of a cunning person is held in the possession of that same person, that person maintains its magical power and potency. So grimoires are not so different from the medieval Anglo-Saxon medical tomes known as leech books, right? Or the volumes with cryptic symbols known as sigils that have often been associated with sorcery or otherwise serve to invoke a particular demon. The only difference being, more or less, that the word grimoire comes from the French figure of speech, meaning hard to understand. So whenever we say grimoire, it's only a sort of private joke to the French. But anyway, speaking of sigils, one of the most famous grimoires is, of course, the Key of Solomon, which some have claimed to be authored by King Solomon himself, and it is one of the major sources of inspiration for Icelandic magic books and magic staves formed since the 1500s in Iceland up until the 19th century. But the Key of Solomon likely dates to the 14th century Renaissance in Italy, and have shown several examples. I have shown several examples here of sigils from that period, which you then see from the 1500s onwards in Iceland. I've shown these in previous videos, so if you want to watch those videos and get more information on that matter, please check the suggested videos at the description of this video. So, as I was saying, the Key of Solomon is divided into 2 books. It exists in numerous translations, some of which contain subtle differences. It's a work of conjurations and curses, purifications as well, and other exercises, and it is a multicultural work with Islamic, Jewish, and late antiquity Greco-Roman influence. It's very likely that it was produced within the Byzantine Empire, probably around the 13th, 14th century, and it spread into Italy or vice versa. But as I've demonstrated in the videos concerning Icelandic magic staves, Gadra Stafir, it is likely that such a work and previous similar treatises of magic were a lot more widespread in Europe and eventually reaching Iceland in the 16th century, early 16th century, when the Byzantine Empire fell and Constantinople was taken by the Muslims, so forcing many to flee and spread throughout Europe, taking with them these magic books, magic treatises, and spreading the knowledge on these magic sigils and magic arts throughout Europe, eventually only reaching Iceland in the 1500s. So it's not strange to see witches using sigils as representations of angels and demons that they might call upon. The Lesser Key of Solomon lists 72 demons representing the hierarchy of hell and their corresponding sigils. presenting a demon's sigil was thought to provide the witch with some degree of control over it. So it's not at all strange to find in several witchcraft traditions of Europe the use of sigils and new historical sigils that follow the same patterns of construction of a sigil as they appear in these older manuscripts and grimoires. And also Christian tradition uses them and would eventually influence other cultures and other magical traditions, such as the example of religious and spiritual practices in Brazil, for instance, where Christian magic influenced the indigenous magical arts of Brazil as well. I have a video about it. And of course, these traditions greatly influenced modern witchcraft, particularly practices within Wicca and other forms of ceremonial magic of our contemporary times. For instance, around the 1940s, Gerald Gardner, considered the father of modern Wicca, wrote his own Book of Shadows, and thus the term stuck. While Book of Shadows is a term generally used to describe a witch's personal volume containing their own incantations and rituals and practices, Gerald Gardner argued that his book included information he had been given as a member of the New Forest Coven decades earlier, along with his own contributions. He asserted that sections of his book included information originally from early witchcraft, but the fact is that most of his book is actually influenced by the Key of Solomon, but also from other influences such as the Gospel of the Witches by Charles Godfrey Leland, and from the occult practitioner and magician Aleister Crowley, which is a subject I have here spoken before on another video, which you can check. So, my dear friends, I hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.